When you have your Series 6 or 7 license, we call you a registered representative. You're a registered rep. For the law portion of this exam, we're going to call you an agent. Not everybody taking this course has a product license. Some of you students out there won't have a 6 or a 7. You're taking the 65 course. That is entirely possible. In order to get your 66 license, however, you must have your Series 7. So some students don't have any product license at all, in which case they have to take the 65. If you have a Series 7 license, you can take either the 65 exam or the 66 exam. But the only people that are allowed to take the 66 exam is those with their Series 7. So the 66 is a combined law exam. So if you take the 66, you don't need to take the 63. If you take the 65, you need to also take the 63. So there's some benefits to being able to take the 66. These are both hard exams, so I won't tell you what I think is easier, because they're both challenging. We talked about the bid price and the ask price. We said the difference between the bid and the ask is called the spread, or the inside market. It's the dealer that makes the market. It's the dealers that trade amongst each other that make the over-the-counter marketplace work. The dealers enter the bid and ask prices. The trade date is the day on which the terms of a transaction, such as price and quantity, are established. The transaction is complete on the settlement date. Trades are completed orally and confirmed in writing. Most trades are done by telephone, although you can never take an order that was left on a voice message. That's never allowed. Settlement date is the date on which payment is made for the stock and the purchaser's name is entered into the record book. You know, FINRA's rule for regular way settlement is T+3 business days. Although Federal Reserve Board Regulation T gives them 2 more days, T+5 business days. Good delivery requires that the stock certificate, if it's not going to be kept in dealer name, if you're actually delivering the stock certificate to the client, good delivery requires that the certificate should not be mutilated. All signatures should be in proper form and be guaranteed, and delivery should include a power of substitution and power of attorney. Confirmations are usually sent the day after the trade date. Confirmations concerning transactions must include the following relevant information: the date of the transaction, the identity, price, and quantity of the security, the amount of commission charged if it's an agency transaction, and the registered representative's identifier. Order tickets include more information than what was found on the confirmation. So order tickets must include the customer's name and account number, the date of the transaction, the identity, price, and quantity of the security, if discretion was exercised, long or short, any price specifications if it was a stop or a limit. If it's a market order, then there are no price specifications, as well as the registered representative's identifier. The test likes you to know what's found on the confirmation versus what is found on the order ticket. So make sure you review those a few times. I expect that your examination will have anywhere from 0 to 4 math questions. The test is not math heavy these days, but there are a few formulas that I would like you to be comfortable with. So we're going to discuss current yield after tax yield total return, real return, and after tax return. So if you were to have math questions, these would be the formulas that I would want you to know. It's entirely possible that you won't have a math question, but you'll have a concept question, like what is total return? What it is yield plus growth. So the question just might be conceptual instead of a math question. But we'll go over these anyway. Get your basic non-programmable calculators out because you'll want to be doing these along with me. We'll start here with current yield. The question could ask you about either a stock or a bond. So I will start with a stock. The formula for current yield for a stock is annual dividends, sum of the previous 4 quarters dividends, divided by current market price. So that's a fraction. Annual dividends divided by current market price. You see the current yield in the stock quote. So if the question says that the annual dividends for the stock were $1 and the current market price is 20, what is this stock's current yield? Take $1, divide it by 20, and you should find 5%. 5%. So current yield on a stock. After tax yield. Dividends on a stock. Depending upon the current year's tax rules, dividends on a stock are either taxable as ordinary income or they're taxable at long-term capital gains rates. Because the test does not like to change every year, I expect that there will be no reference on your exam to what is called a qualified dividend. So even though the term qualified dividend could be true, now let me say something about qualified dividends. They have nothing to do with a qualified retirement plan. A qualified dividend is a dividend that is paid by a U.S. corporation and your investor has held the stock for long enough to get a special tax break for that dividend. Qualified dividends are taxable at long-term capital gains rates currently. That's not set to be this way forever. When is it going to change? Who knows? I do not expect this concept to be on the test anymore. The term qualified dividend, I do not expect you will see. But I have to at least mention it because it's something that is true in the real world. And as an investor, would you rather have your dividend taxable at long-term capital gains rates or at ordinary income? Long-term capital gains rates are more beneficial because the way that the current tax system is set up, the long-term capital gains rates are less. So with all of that said, don't worry about qualified dividends for the test. I do not expect there to be any references to them on the exam. So if you're going to have a question about after-tax yield, the question is going to give you a tax bracket and just use whatever tax bracket is given to you in the question. So forget about more information, things that you actually know are true in the real world. In this situation, forget about those. So the test question tells you that the client is in a 25% tax bracket. So there's two ways to do after-tax yield. There's the short way, which is to take the 5% current yield and multiply it by how much of the 5% after taxes do we get to keep. So do we keep 100%? No. 25%? No, that's how much is owed in taxes. So 100% minus the 25%, the complement of your tax bracket. That's what you want to multiply this by to figure out what this stock's after-tax yield is. And it looks like 0.035, which is 3.5%. The after-tax yield for this stock. There isn't another way to do this that a lot of times my students like to do because it allows them to follow the logic here. And if you do it the fast way or the long way, it's really entirely up to you. So the other way that you could do this, which if we did the math right will give you the same exact answer, that's the beauty of math, is to take this dollar and subtract from it how much is owed in taxes. So 25 cents is what is owed in taxes. So $1 minus the 25 cents leaves us with 75 cents in income. We divide the 75 cents by the current market price of the of the stock, which is $20. 75 cents divided by $20 gives us the same answer, 3.5%, 0.035%. So you can do it either way. Like I said, a lot of times students feel more comfortable doing it the longer way. Total return. Total return, I told you already, is yield plus growth. Yield plus growth. So the yield on a stock is the dividends. The yield on the stock is the dividends. So it's going to have to tell us in a question that you bought the stock for a specific price and that you sold the stock for a specific price in order for us to have a question about total return. So let me give you a question here, and I'm going to write it up here on the board so that we all have the same information. So the question says that you bought a stock at 20. It paid dividends of $1. You sold the stock one year later at 22. And the question also says that inflation during your holding period was 5%. So all of this information is given to you in the question. To figure out total return, be careful. This inflationary rate is given to you in the question, but this is just there to trick you. Inflation is not a component of total return. Inflation is going to be a component of real return, but we're not quite there yet. So the test is famous for giving you more information than you need. Be very careful. So we're going to ignore inflation when we do total return. So total return is the yield, the dollar, that's the dividend, plus or minus, but plus because we have appreciation. It would be negative if you had sold the stock at a loss. In this case, we bought the stock at 20, we sold the stock at 22, so our growth is $2. And then in the denominator of our fraction, be very careful. We need to always put in the denominator of the fraction when we're figuring out total return what was paid for the stock. So the $20. The total return, $3 divided by $20, gives us a total return of, use your calculator, 15%. 15%. Not bad. Total return. Real return. Real return is in this box for a reason. What it is total return minus inflation. So in this case, the inflationary rate is relevant. sometimes it's in a question and it doesn't help you at all, and sometimes you actually would need to use it. So if the question was real return, question that we discussed already, bought a stock for 20, paid dividends of $1, sold the stock for 22, inflation is 5%. What is the real return on this stock? Take your 15%, minus out inflation. The real return is 10%. I do expect a question there. After-tax return. You'll never have after-tax real return. So real return is here in the bubble, and now we're going to ignore it. After-tax return, in order to answer that, they'd have to give you in a question the investor's tax bracket. So let's say the question says that they're in a 25% tax bracket. So we talked about the fastest way to do this. The fastest way to do this question would be to take the total return of 15% and multiply it by the complement of the tax bracket. So 15% is the total return times 0.75. It gives us an after-tax return of 11.25%. 11.25%. So conceptually, you know that it has to be less than 15%. It has to be less than 15%. How else could you do this? Students like the ability to do it the long way. So if you would like to do it the long way, you're going to have to take the dividends plus the appreciation. So your $3, and you subtract out the taxes owed. So $3, this was your dividends plus your appreciation, minus the taxes that you owed. So you owe taxes, 25% of $3 is 75 cents, which leaves you with $2.25 after you paid taxes. What goes into the denominator of this fraction is what you paid for the stock when you bought it, which you paid $20. So $2.25 divided by $20. Use your calculator. Don't just trust me. Make sure I did the math right. You should get 0.1125, so 11.25%. So they're equal. They're the same. You can do it either way. Usually the more you practice, the more comfortable you are with the shortcut. But it's really up to you. You can do it either way. So that is practicing the math on a stock. I gave you the formula for current yield. I said that current yield is annual dividends divided by current market price. And that is true. But every once in a while on the test, you're going to have a question on what I like to call plain old yield. There's no such thing as plain old yield. But if the question says, simply asks you for yield, I want to show you how that's different from a current yield question. For example, it says that you bought the stock at 20. At 20. The stock has a current market price of 22. The annual dividends were $1. So they give you information enough to answer two questions. If the question asks you for yield, I need you to be really careful. We take the annual dividends of $1 And in the denominator, what do you think what goes in the denominator? What we paid for the stock or its current market price? What goes into the denominator for yield is what you paid for the stock. So 5%. If the question had asked you, what is the stock's current yield, then you would have taken the dollar and you would have put in the denominator the 22. So you divide by the 22 if they ask you for current yield. So be careful. I cannot tell you how many students get tricked. We talk a lot in the course about current yield. We don't talk so much about yield. They always give you the current market price. So it's really easy to get them to just pick the wrong thing to put into the denominator of your fraction. So yield in the denominator, just like for total return, what went in the denominator is what you paid for the security. So what you paid for the stock or what you paid for the bond, depending upon the question. So please be very careful. There is a difference between current yield and yield, or plain old yield, like I like to call it. Let's do some math about a bond. Current yield on a bond is annual interest divided by current market price. Now that math we practiced when we did the whole bond teeter-totter. So this isn't new to you. So let's say the test question says you bought a bond at 80 points. So this is what you paid for the bond. And the bond has a nominal yield of 10%. So this bond's annual interest is $100. The annual interest is always a percentage of par. Be careful, don't get tricked. It's always a percentage of par. Par in a bond is $1,000. So $100 is our annual interest. The current market price of this bond is $800. Now, if you remember the teeter-totter, if the nominal yield is 10%, but this bond's market price, the price has gone down, the current yield has to be what? More or less than 10%. It has to be more than 10%. So if you think it's 8, think again. Be very careful here. So conceptually, you know it's more than 10%. It is 12.5%. 12.5%. Interest on a bond is taxable at ordinary income rates. You could have a question about after-tax yield. In order to answer after-tax yield, it has to give you the investor's tax bracket. So the tax bracket could be 10% or 15%. It's commonly 25% or even 30% on the test. But go with whatever it is that they have given you. The fastest way to figure out after-tax yield is to take your current yield of 12.5%, multiply it by the complement of the tax bracket, 100% minus 25%. So times 0.75. It gives you an answer of 0.09375. So 9.375%. So that would be the faster way to do the math for after-tax yield. But you like the long way. I know most of you out there do. So you take the interest, you subtract out the taxes that were owed, which leaves you with $75. In the denominator, we put the $800. So double check. $75 divided by $800. It better give you 9.375. It does. 9.375%. You're never going to miss a math question because you're not sure where to round it. There's never anything like that on the test. And actually, the math questions are fairly easy. So if you're feeling like you're getting just a really weird number, you're probably doing the math wrong. So just start over, do it again, maybe mark it for review, move on, and come back to it later on. You can always do that. Within the test, you can always mark questions for review. The test tends to start off easy and get hard in the middle, and then gets easy again at the end. Although once over all these years, I had a student, he took the test in California, and he sent me an email, and he said, his whole test was hard. That's not normally how it is. It normally does follow kind of a bell-shaped curve where it's easy and hard and then easy again at the end. So if you're in the middle of the test and things are feeling really painful, you want to mark a question for review, go to the next question and come back to it later. You can always do that. It will get better again as you get towards the end. A little bit easier. Total return for this bond. So total return is what? It's yield plus growth. Yield plus growth. So the yield on a bond is the annual interest. So annual interest plus appreciation divided by what you paid for the bond. Divided by what you paid. Now, for a total return question, the question is going to have to give you a story. So let's say it says, you bought the bond at 80. It has a nominal yield of 10%. And you sold the bond at 85. So our annual interest is 10% of par, so it's $100. What's our appreciation? 5 points. What's a point worth on a bond? $10. So our appreciation here is $50. What goes into the denominator is what was paid for this bond. So we have $150 divided by 800. That is our total return. 150 divided by $800. So that gives us 18.75%. 0.1875, 18.75%. Now, if the question had given you inflation, remember, inflation does not matter for total return. Inflation does matter for real return. So if it says in the test question that inflation during your holding period was 5%, what is this bond's real return? 13.75. So you take the total return and you subtract out inflation to get to real return. After tax return. After tax return, they'll have to give you the tax bracket. And we have a holding period here of 1 year. I don't expect that the test will mix together interest, which is taxable at ordinary income rates, with a long-term capital gain. The long-term capital gain would have a different tax rate. So I'm going to make this bond's holding period 1 year, which is taxable at short-term capital gains rates. So the question gives me a tax bracket of 25%. So it has to give me that or I can't answer after tax return. So the fast way, take your 18.75 and multiply it by the complement of the tax bracket. So 100% minus 25%, 75%, gives you an after-tax return of 14.06. So 4.1406 or 14%. But if you'd like to do it the other way, I have to show you how you could do it the longer way as well. So you have your interest income is $100. Your appreciation is $50. You owe taxes at a 25% tax rate. So $150 minus taxes owed of $37.50. So after taxes, you get to keep $112.50. You need to divide into that what you paid for the bond. What you paid for the bond was $800. $112.50 divided by 800, you will get 14.06%. These would be the potential math questions, the things that if you're going to have 4 math questions, they're going to come from here. You will notice in the PDF, there are a few more practice situations. There are math questions that you can go through where I give you a long and detailed explanation of exactly how you get to the answer. A lot of times students hate math. You just don't use math very often anymore in the world we live in. So you will want to practice these so that you do get these right if you end up having some math questions. So I'm not going to go through all of the examples that are in the book, but go ahead and look through them yourself. So 1 through 13, the examples that follow in the PDF of this course, I want you to do those on your own. We've already done lots of examples. But I do want to explain to you the math behind yield to maturity. Yield to maturity is a yield that is important for a bond. And you don't have a financial calculator, but there is the potential ability for the test to ask you a question on how to figure out a bond's yield to maturity. If they're going to ask you a mathematical question here, they're going to have to tell you how much you bought the bond for and when it reaches maturity. Because we're going to have to either accrete the interest. If we bought the bond at a discount, we're going to have to write up the interest every year. Or if we bought the bond at a premium, we're going to have to write down, amortize the interest. So let me give you some examples first on how to accrete or amortize the interest on a bond. So we'll start off with a bond that you bought at a discount. So it says you bought the bond at 80, which we know is $800. And it says that the bond matures in 10 years. It has a nominal yield of 10%. So we know that the annual interest on the bond, we know that the annual interest on the bond is $100 and that does not change. But we paid $800 to get back when the bond reaches maturity $1,000. So we have to account for this $200 difference. So this is important. It's given to you in the question. How much longer is left until the bond reaches maturity? So 10 years. So we're going to accrete the interest, which is to write it up. So we take the annual interest of $100 and we take the $200, which is going to have to be accreted over 10 years. So we're going to divide by 10 so that we have $20 in accreted interest. $20 in accreted interest. So we're going to make a fraction. And this 120 is what is going to go in our numerator. So $120 is going to go in our numerator. What goes in the denominator when you're doing yield to maturity is the average of the two prices. So you paid in this situation a discount. You paid less than par value. You're going to get, when the bond reaches maturity, back $1,000. So $1,800. And then we need to get the average of these two prices. So we need to divide by 2. I get a question all the time, why do you divide by 2? Because there's two prices. So $1,800 divided by 2. So that's $900. That is what goes in the denominator to figure out your yield to maturity. That's as close as you'll ever need to be. It's not exactly perfect, but that's all the test is going to expect you to be able to know. Now, what can you tell me about this bond's yield to maturity? Is it going to be more or less than 10%? It's going to be more than 10%. The current yield on this bond would be $100 divided by 800. That's 12.5%. We've already done that math question. So if you take 120 and divide it by $900, that gives you this bond's yield to maturity. That gives you this bond's yield to maturity. So when you take 120 and divide it by 900, you get 13.3%. Possibly a math question on the test. If the bond, instead of being purchased at a discount, had been purchased at a premium, the bond's yield to maturity, we're going to have to amortize the interest. So it says that you paid 120 points for the bond, so $1,200. The bond has a nominal yield of 10%. And it says the bond matures in 10 years. So we have annual interest of $100, and we paid $1,200 to get back, when the bond reaches maturity, $1,000. So in this case, we're getting $200 less back than what we paid. We divide that by 10 years. Now we have to amortize $20 a year. So we have our $100 in interest minus $20. So this is our numerator, $80. What goes into the denominator is the average of what we paid versus what we get. So we paid $1,200 for this bond. When it reaches maturity, we get $1,000 back. So $2,200. Divide this by 2 because we want the average of the two prices. The denominator is $1,100. So $80 divided by $1,100. That gives you this bond's yield to maturity. You know that it has to be less than 10%. It has to be, because you understand conceptually the teeter-totter. So even if you forget how to do the math, you can usually get at least 50% of the way to the right answer. There's usually one of the choices is going to be the bond's current yield, and then the other one is the right answer, the bond's yield to maturity. Now, one other thing that might come up in this area, if a bond is called, and it's called at 104, it's called at a premium. So I mentioned this earlier, but if it's called at 104, then the issuer paid you $1,040. You might have a math question as it refers to yield to call. So it's a very similar formula. If the bond is called in 5 years for $40 more than you paid for it, or for $60 more than you paid for it, you're going to have to account for the fact that you're getting back more than you paid for the bond and accrete that interest. The denominator is still the average of what you paid plus what you get when the bond is called divided by 2 because there's 2 prices. So sometimes there's a math question on yield to call. Simply knowing the teeter-totter, simply knowing that if the bond was purchased at a premium, the lowest yield is yield to call. That usually helps you get to the right answer anyway. We know if the bond is purchased at a premium, the most important yield for the investor is the bond's yield to call, since it's the lowest yield that they may experience. So it is possible you'll have a math question on yield to call as well. So I don't want you to be surprised if that should show up.